So first I want to give a shout out to those watching online, including some of the folks from USAA. So appreciate you guys. Thank you for allowing us to come to this conference, and also for those that are watching online. So as Terry mentioned, today we're going to talk about switching to our enterprise to a managed cloud Selenium grid, and yes, it was absolutely worth it. So before I go too far into it, I wanted to really talk to two different individuals that we have today, which really is those that are new to Sauce Labs, that maybe are kind of checking this out, trying to see what, is it worth it to switch to a grid? Kind of some things we've learned also out of that. And then also, maybe you've been with your company for a while and they've had Sauce Labs as a part of the infrastructure for quite some time. But you have another initiative that's coming up and you're trying to decide, okay, how am I going to get my management, my executives on board with what we're trying to accomplish? And so that's really the two audiences that we want to talk to today. So like Terry mentioned, I'm Bryan Osterkamp. I'm the lead technical architect, and really all that means is I provide the oversight for all of the aspects of the software development lifecycle, such as unit testing, integration testing, specialized testing, test data management, services virtualization, kind of the whole gamut across all of the technology stacks that we have. I've been at USAA for about 14 years, and I've been in the testing architecture space for about 1 year. And Johnny here is one of our automation support specialists on one of the Scrum teams that I'm the product owner of and was part of the whole journey. So before I want to get started, I wanted to see, do we have any USAA members here today? Awesome. How long have you been a member for?
I've been a member for 3 years.
3 years.
My grandfather into my wife.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's great. Thank you.
It's great.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being a member. So since some of you may not know who USAA is, this is our mission statement, but essentially we're a financial services company, and so we provide services for banking products, so it could be credit card, mortgage, auto lending. We have auto insurance, we've got investments, and so as you can imagine, we're highly regulated, and we also have a lot of industry oversight, and which also, because our members are the military and their family, and those that have honorably served, security is a very big deal to us because we have members that are very high-ranking military officers, and so privacy and security is very important. And so when you start looking at moving to an enterprise to a cloud grid, there's things that we had to take into account, which was very important for that. So just to give an idea of the audience here, how many of you are in IT shops of under 100 people? Okay, a few. How about 100 to 1,000? A few more? How about more than 1,000? Okay, good. So it's a good mix. So that's where USA falls in. We've got thousands of developers and testers, automators all across the world within the US in addition. And so really, when you start looking at the scale that we have, that's how our journey will show the scale that we have and where we've been going through. And Johnny's now going to talk about where we were and kind of where we've been going, and then I'll finish up with really some of the lessons learned that we've had.
Awesome. Thanks, Bryan. Hey, everybody. Great to be here. Thanks for coming out. So before I talk about kind of where we are now and what exactly we're doing now, just a brief overview of the Selenium grid and how it works conceptually, so that you'll kind of be able to follow us here as we go forward. So here on the far left, we've got what happens on, say, our local dev machines, which is we have test assets. Most of what we use is Java at this time. This is what this is based off of. So we have our test assets running on a machine, and a developer presses go. And then what that does is that streams Selenium commands telling the browser where to go. And that goes through the Selenium Grid Hub process, and that gets kicked out it gets managed between various nodes which have different OSs, different browsers of different versions. And then finally, those nodes end up pointing back to our application under test on a site, some sort of an environment back home. So when we first started out, right now I'm working for Bryan. Bryan's kind of got the grand strategy of where we're going and how our systems link up, and then I'm on a team that kind of puts all that into place. But before I did that, I was just another automation engineer I was brought in, learning Selenium. So we didn't have Sauce Labs, we didn't have a Selenium grid, so we had to figure this all out on our own. When I started writing the automation, it was, we were just writing Java, press go on the Selenium test, and it pops up IE on my local machine, and it runs through the test. And of course, it's hard to write test and run test on that same machine at the same time, right? So immediately we see this is not scalable, it's not going to work very well. We need to run 1,000 tests a day, and that's impossible given what we're currently doing. So we started exploring the Selenium grid, and our first thing was to have our own Selenium grid, and we didn't have dedicated hardware, dedicated resources. I'm sure many of you fall into this same boat. I wouldn't be surprised if all of you have gone through this at some point. But this is my workspace, or a place very much like it. These are my coworkers' PCs, and every day at about 5 p.m., we got very structured office hours, so about 5 p.m. everybody goes home, and that's when the Selenium grid comes up. I press go on a process on my machine, and it goes out to all these machines, executes commands, copies files back and forth, starts up the latest copy of the server, and now all of my coworkers' machines are now my Selenium zombie nodes. They are outfitted with all of one OS and one browser with one version, but hey, at least we're running at scale now, right? No longer am I confined to what I've got on my own local machine. So unfortunately, a few of those guys, that comes with a lot of maintenance hassle. Some of my guys work late. Some machines get rebooted overnight, right? So we drop machines from the cloud. And then if we're running, our exact needs was to run just over 1,000 iterations of a test in one day, or in one night. So every night we'd press go to make sure that we had no big regressions. We were doing a full back-end system rewrite, and we had to run all these tests to make sure that we didn't break critical infrastructure in our efforts. So we would leave for the night, press go, hope that the Selenium grid works. We'd come back in the next morning and it said 900 tests have failed because of various things. Machine Java updates, pushes, various things happened. We have no control over these machines that we have. So we were very quickly able to see that this wasn't ideal. It wasn't going to work out very well. And then, push the button. Yeah. After that, so that was one little development area, right? And we have hundreds of development teams that were doing similar things, experimenting with their own grid and seeing how that would work. And we just realized that it was a headache doing such. So we figured, we're a big enterprise. If we put something standard in place and stand up a Selenium grid, maybe 20 nodes that everybody could use, everybody just points to one endpoint, and then we have a central team managing that and keeping it up and alive at all times, that's at least better than all of these areas spinning up their Selenium grid, using it for an hour, and then not just using having idle resources for the rest of the time. That's a waste of money. It's not very efficient and all that. So we put together an infrastructure grid, and that was, I don't know if that was any better, to be honest. It was still a lot of work just keeping the thing up. Now, instead of our tests failing, we have users banging on our door. It's down. Is it up yet? Is it up yet? Is it up yet? And we just ran into problem after problem after problem, just keeping the thing up. We ran into an issue with the Selenium hub. Turns out the documentation actually says this hub is not supported being run as a Windows service. It doesn't run very well as a Windows service. That's why it says that. So it would go down all the time. It just wasn't working. We couldn't keep this grid up, and that's about the time you came into the testing sphere of where my team was, and you saw how we were doing things, and it wasn't working very, very well. It wasn't ideal, and Bryan, being new to the area, saw this, and he's like, "What are you guys doing?" So we started some conversations, and he pointed us down the path of Sauce Labs, which he'll cover a little bit more now.
Yep. So as Johnny mentioned, coming over, so as I talked about earlier, I moved over from the banking architecture space. I was the architect over the credit card space and the auto lending space and then the mortgage space. And before that, I was a developer. And so when I look as an architect at teams and systems and what they're doing, really what's important to me is what's your core competency? What is this team doing that is unique to USAA, that makes it where it's a differentiator between what else is going on? And so, as Johnny talked about earlier, right, on the left-hand side, you'll see these are the tests that we wrote. This is important that we manage those and maintain those because this is how, we make sure that our products are quality. On the right-hand side, you'll see the systems under test. That's the application that we wrote itself, right? So those are two critical pieces that we need to manage, we need to maintain. There's not a way to outsource those things. But when you look in the middle about this grid, and then as he talked about earlier, it's not just I want to have either a Windows 7 box with IE 9, or I can get a Windows 7 box with IE 9. Okay, well, it's not a lot of options. And so really moving these responsibilities over to Sauce Labs provided the ability where our teams, instead of having the madness of keeping and maintaining these grids up, are able to actually focus on testing or also focus on innovating. And so we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're focusing on what provides value to the organization and then allow others to do the other things. So when we started looking at it, and we did decide that we wanted to go with Sauce Labs, obviously, what was important, and like I mentioned earlier, what's important anytime you're working on a new vision or a new venture that you're working on is what I call passionate pilot people. And I break that down, the 3 Ps, into passionate pilot people. And what that means is you want to make sure that the people you're working with and the people that are helping out are passionate and that they're not satisfied with the status quo. You're going to have some people that don't mind managing and maintaining the grid and just kind of being used to what they have to do, versus there's going to be people that are not satisfied and say, how can we improve upon this? And so you want to use those passionate individuals. They're also oftentimes not the formal leaders in the organization. They're oftentimes the ones that the leaders will look to say, okay, what's the temperature of where we're at? How do we want to move forward? And they're going to drive that change. The other piece that's important is you want to start small. If you start large, especially in an enterprise as large as ours, you're going to have way too many battles you're trying to fight. So you want to make sure you start small. That means that you can test and learn quietly without having a bunch of other areas that are too involved and providing feedback that you just can't handle from a small team that we have. And by doing that, then you're also able to create a groundswell and be able to move teams. Once you find the value in this area, then you can say, hey, bank, this is what the auto team has been doing, and so then you can start growing it that way. The other part that's important is not only do you want to work with your automation testers, you also want to work with your developers, because oftentimes your developers are some of those informal leaders in the organization that can really help drive things. The next piece that was really critical, and that was a lot of what my role was to get our managers and executives on board. Because if you can help get your executives and your managers passionate and excited and understand the value of, hey, my teams don't need to be doing this, they need to be doing testing, they're going to give you the buy-in and support, the funding. They're going to get through a lot of those obstacles that you may be running into that as an individual team you can't work through. But you can also, what's nice is when one team's doing really well, you can kind of tell the executive, hey, this team's doing really well over here. Why aren't you doing this, right? And so then you get a little bit of good, friendly competition. So the next piece that I want to talk through, there's been a lot of conversations they've gone deep into the code and explaining how, Sauce Labs and tests might run. But there may be some of you out there that don't even say, let's take a step back and understand what is this whole ecosystem that we're running through. So if you look on the left-hand side, the way that I explained to the different teams that are getting up and running on Sauce Labs and they're interested in it, or really any automation testing, is I break it down into 3 different aspects of your internal ecosystem, which is I want to do something based on an event. So if you hear something about continuous integration, continuous delivery, I'm checking my code in, that's running a test based on an event. Otherwise, as Johnny talked about earlier, maybe it's based on time. I want to do it every night because it's such a large test bed that I want to run against, or there's people that are on the box that I want to use right now, and so then I have to wait. The other piece is maybe you have something where it's ad hoc, where I want to do something that's, it's not based on time, it's not based on an event, it's based on somebody, maybe they applied a security patch that's not tied to anything else, and so you want to make sure that it works. And so those are the 3 different triggers that we focus on. And then also you'll see the Sauce Connect tunnel, and that is the connection. So while we've moved the ability to run our test internally, that also means now I've got an internal network and an external integration, and so the Sauce Connect tunnel is critical for that. And then the other thing, as a large enterprise, and probably even some of the smaller organizations, while Sauce Labs does store the test results and screenshots within their cloud, we'll want to enrich our own data, and so we'll want to pull that test metadata back into reports, and so that way I can see, okay, how are my unit tests running? How are my API tests running? How are those Sauce Lab tests running? So then that way you have it all in one space, and you can do your analytics based on that instead of just having it tied into Sauce Labs itself. And so Johnny's going to talk about some of the challenges that we ran into.
So yeah, switching over to Sauce Labs was great. I didn't have to maintain a grid anymore. I didn't have to log in late at night to stand the thing back up while all of our tests were running and starting to fail. But it definitely wasn't without challenges. One of the first things that we noticed was, but prior to switching over to Sauce Labs, and we've been running on Sauce Labs for about 6 months now. We had a couple months pilot, just feeling it out, making sure that it would be working for us. But one of the first things that we noticed was that we had introduced the internet into these whole tests. Prior to that, our tests were all working inside of our network. They were talking to Selenium hubs and Selenium nodes within our own network, and that happened really fast. Kind of 3 levels of testing that I figured out. If you want to make sure that your test is solid from the get-go, you'll start developing it locally and you'll execute it locally, make sure that there's no synchronization problems, make sure that everything communicates back and forth just fine, and then you can escalate to a Selenium grid that's hosted locally without having to go through the internet. That'll show you some synchronization problems, let you know where you need to put in some timing fixes, and then you take it one step further, and that's what we did here. Once we got on Sauce Labs, we realized that most of our tests were failing due to the way that we've written our Selenium. We never had any experience prior to this putting in synchronization, page weights. We use explicit weights, recommend explicit weights solely. We do not use implicit weights. And now that we've got everybody switched over to using explicit weights and understanding how they work and waiting for the proper conditions on a page, we tell nobody use Java sleep, thread.sleep, none of that, no hard-coded weights. We're using expected conditions for everything. Now that we started doing that, converted all of our tests over, then we had some reliability even running on Sauce Labs. But that was something that we didn't predict. Introducing the internet would add some additional latency and all the fallout that would cause. But it was pretty easy to troubleshoot and work through those things. Again, just spreading best practices, converting our tests, tweaking it here and there, make sure that they're all running and synchronizing properly. Once we got through that, we were able to deal with some of the more difficult issues. We have several pop-ups, and we refer to these as our pop-up problems. We have various things. We use Java, so there's some Java downloads that must occur. Somebody launches into the web app, it pops up, do you want to run this, yes or no? Well, Selenium can't handle these pop-ups, so we had to explore pre-run executables in order to set up the environment in certain ways to run those tests on Sauce Labs, because we're spinning up a clean, pristine VM with a new OS, a new browser every test run that we're doing. So it was a bit of an adjustment to get all of those in place, and we're still working through some of our pop-up problems. Some things we believe that we're not able to solve through pre-run executables, and Sauce has been super helpful in helping us troubleshoot all of these. Thank you, Sam. You've been key in all of this. But it wasn't just challenges that we found when we moved to Sauce Labs. Actually, some of our challenges, a different pop-up problem we had before Sauce, but it went away after we moved over to Sauce. Not sure how many of you might have seen this, but specifically we run a bunch of tests in IE. That's our primary browser that we've been running on. So we would end up with a situation like this. We've got our web application, right? And just imagine that you've got your web application, you click a link, it pops up like a rich text dialog box in addition. So you got window A, your main window, window B pops up, and then you need to interact with window B. You click save, and then it flips back to window A, right? Well, our Selenium locally within our network, due to our configuration settings, our IE security profile settings and all that, Selenium would say, what pop-up window? I don't see that. We do a Selenium get all window handles, and it would say there's only the main window, even though we're staring at both windows sitting right there. So it has to do with security settings, and we never did come up with a solution for that on our local machines in our internal network. But the moment we switched over to Sauce, they don't have these special customizations that we've got, so it was able to handle this like a champ. So we were immediately able to, all of our teams that were having trouble with this very common scenario, we've been able to point them at Sauce Labs, and they can run their tests that they've previously been blocked or had to run manually previously. So it definitely solves some challenges as well. At the same time, we've got a clean, pristine VM. It doesn't have our own internal settings. That's a good and a bad thing. It lets us overcome some problems. It brings up some additional challenges. And Brian's going to talk a little bit more about what we're still dealing with and the road to come.
Yep. So thank you, Johnny.
Yep.
So one of the things that what I call it is we've got gremlins in the system. And so what happens whenever we are working through, so we got a central support team that supports it, but we'll notice as an enterprise, because we have thousands and thousands of developers and automators, and we have thousands and thousands of operations people too, and security and all of that, what will happen is they'll change some security proxy setting, and all of a sudden Sauce Labs Connect doesn't work, or something like that. And so we've had to work a lot with our teams to not only have our automation teams understand it, but also have our operations and security teams talk about, okay, well, let's make sure that we, whenever we're locking down the systems, we're not locking down the access that we have to the Sauce Connect tunnel. So one of the things that I think is related to this is what I'd call it is, we want to treat it like every other component, right? You want to think about this as an infrastructure component. Now, again, we're not maintaining and managing an internal grid, but now we have this tunnel that we need to make sure that we're supporting. And so Mark actually did a great job a few talks ago in track 2, so you might want to take a look at that. But in regards to tunnels, right? And so some of the things he talked about was whenever we have a tunnel stood up, we want to make sure we have multiple of the same named tunnels, because then if a tunnel goes down or we have issues or something like that, then we don't have the issue that we'll see it as the support team, but our end users won't see it, and so that's critical. And not only are we having multiple tunnels with the same name, we also have multiple Sauce Connect servers, so we have multiple Linux boxes that we have stood up to make sure that we're validating that if something goes down, we've got the redundancy for that. And so on top of that, we have monitors that make sure that not only are the tunnels up via the APIs, but also that we're accessing those, that the Linux boxes themselves are being managed and maintained and updated. And so those are some critical things that you want to make sure that you're thinking about. Because we have a centralized support team that supports that, we'll get social notifications essentially that says, hey, this monitor failed, and so then we can get up and running before any of the other teams notice it, which is really the critical piece, right? Just like you're supporting any production system, it's okay if there's some mice that fell off the wheel if no one knows about it in the background, and so that's what our team supports. The other thing that was critical for us, as with any large organization, is we wanted to make sure we had single sign-on set up, not only for security reasons, but also just efficiency reasons, right? So how many of you guys probably have multiple usernames and passwords? Well, there's two things. One is you use a new one and you forget it and you write it down. That's not good. Or you use the same username and password that you have for your internal network. Well, that's even worse from a security perspective. You don't want to do that. And so making sure we had single sign-on set up was very important for that. The other thing was that we massively parallelize our tests so that we can take advantage of Sauce Labs. What Johnny didn't mention earlier was we didn't only just have one grid, we had multiple grids. So bank had a grid, and auto insurance had a grid, and everybody else had a grid. And so they weren't able to massively parallelize their tests because they only had 10 nodes here, and 10 nodes here, and 10 nodes here. And so by having one central location that we could support it was very important. So more obstacles to come, right? So one of the challenges that we have, and it's common with what you guys have all been hearing, right, is finding and fixing flaky tests, understanding what those issues are, having the analytics around those are very important. We like to say our environment is special, right, which everybody else says that. So those are some of the things that we're working through on how that might work. Making sure that you're focusing on, if there's firewall rule changes or proxy settings, we want to make sure that we have those things resolved also. So that's our story. Yours might be a little bit different, but we wanted to make sure that, if you are an enterprise or you're looking at coming on with Sauce Labs, understanding what issues you may run into, what things may have some challenges. Don't waste your time maintaining your own grid and having those sleepless nights or taking over your buddy's system to use it for that. You want to make sure that you're starting with passionate pilot people, that you're starting off on the right foot with that. You'll run into issues. You'll solve some with Sauce. You'll have new ones that come up that you want to make sure you're working through. And then make sure that you're treating your Sauce Labs connection as infrastructure. So thank you. If you want to contact us, you can contact both of us on LinkedIn. So any questions?
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that you guys are a pretty large enterprise and you have a lot of different teams and developers all working in Sauce Labs now. So how do you guys manage and organize the test results when you have so many different teams, like kind of working out of the same dashboard? And I imagine probably logging into your Sauce Labs dashboard, you just see thousands of tests running. So how do you digest that and present that in a way that gives you valuable data?
So we've got, it's in the way that we've set up our accounts, and understand that Sauce has recently revamped or is revamping. They're constantly tweaking the way that their user system works. So when we originally set up, one thing to understand is that we did enable single sign-on. So that means that when somebody navigates to Sauce Labs, they get signed into their account. Like I go to Sauce Labs and I'm signed in as John Fisher. And so I get to see my test runs. That's what pops up for me when I log in, and that's it. And that's a good thing because I don't get everybody's noise. So if I go in and I want to start developing one single test, I'm running on my local machine, I'm pressing go, it's running under my account, I set my credentials for that. We've got some infrastructure, some framework stuff in place that magically handles some of this when you're running locally, like you've heard in the other talks. We're doing the same thing as other folks are doing there. But the way that we've structured our teams, the single sign-on stuff takes care of itself, and each individual is a user. Then we've also set up some what we call automation accounts, and these are group accounts. So if we've got our bank credit cards team, we've got an automation account. So if they're developing local tests, they run it under their own account, they go to Sauce Labs and they see it listed there. But then when we get ready to make it an actual official test that's part of the regression bed or part of our CI runs, then they'll change that test to where it's using their group's automation account. So now it's a credit cards test and it's running under the credit cards account. Now the head of credit cards, the manager over there, can open up the credit cards dashboard, and we've got a page where it lists all of our different dashboards, and they can click and go see, well, what's run for credit cards? What's the status? What's the trending on that? And the new Sauce Labs analytics stuff, which is just amazing, allows them to drill into why their specific tests are failing. Why are our credit card tests failing? Why are our auto insurance tests failing? And then, so we've used that to segregate it. And I understand, talking with the saucers here, that they're coming up with much better ways, more efficient ways to handle that, team hierarchy and structuring improvements that's only going to make it easier to manage. But we've got one admin account which can start tunnels, create new users, do all sorts of organization stuff, and sees everything. If you log into that dashboard, yeah, you see everything. You're overwhelmed with things. You get to see it's neat though, because having that visibility into all those tests, you can see, well, credit cards is failing because of session not found exceptions, but bank is failing because they're doing this other thing instead. So it gives a lot of visibility, and then separating them out, they can see specifically why their tests are failing. So it helps a lot. We have about 5 minutes left. Any other questions? Here in front.
How do you approach exception handling, and are you persisting your results into your own repository with respect to screenshots and video?
So we are still working out exactly how that reporting is going to work. And Bryan's been doing a lot of work on test management tools and the actual databases or whatever our repository will be, where we will house those results, keep our screenshots long-term. For right now, we got immediate gains when we switched over to Sauce, because they've got screenshots, videos, command logs, all this stuff that we did not have visibility to before. So while we need to set up a long-term sort of a system to collect all of these results where we can store them for years, Sauce gave us immediate gains. Now our testers can go in and see these things immediately. Exception handling, being that we have so many teams doing their own automation, we try not to be too prescriptive on how they handle it, though we do try to give best practices, and some of that is in their test automation frameworks, because we've got like a global USAA framework which they'll pull down, and then they'll extend from there, and then they'll have usually an area specific framework where it knows how to interact with their specific application. But it should have all the reporting and everything built into it already. So we recommend that they approach exceptions with care. You need to understand your application and understand when this bad thing in the system occurs, that is recoverable or not recoverable, number one. And so you can throw specific exception classes or inherited exceptions based on whether it's recoverable or not. And then just being very clear, knowing your system, knowing what the state of the system is, and not hiding anything. I've heard that from most of the talks here. I think everybody's mentioned it. Don't hide your results. When something goes wrong, don't cover it up. Don't have empty catch blocks where you just catch a no such element exception. You need to see that, and that needs to bubble up, and your test needs to stop and say, hey, there was a problem. This is what it was. It needs to be very, very clear. So that's really the only prescriptions that we put around how to handle your exceptions, is be clear, don't hide things, use what we put in at an enterprise level to make things easier for you.
Yeah, so to add what Johnny talked about also, as far as, what's our vision, where we're trying to go as far as getting the results back. We didn't mention, but being in a large enterprise, we've got, client JavaScript applications, we've got mobile applications, we've got .NET, we've got mainframe, we have all those things. And so having one framework that supports all of that, we haven't solved that, that solution yet. So talk to me if you have. But what we have been doing is saying, all right, well, these are the results that we want to make sure everybody hits this, say this results endpoint or REST service that you need to call, because then that really breaks down the barriers between your technology stacks, because any one of those can call a web service and send the results to it, or file exchange or something like that. So really what we're looking at is making it where whatever the test results are, oftentimes it's going to be in a format like JUnit or TestNG or Selenium or whatever, where you're going to be able to get the results back in a standard format, and then we're going to want to pull those into a data warehouse so that we can start seeing trending and dashboards over time. We haven't done that yet, but that's what we're looking at doing, is making sure that we're able to see all of that data together, not just based on this technology stack, but like Johnny talked about, based on what experience or product line we have, because that's really what our management and our teams are focused on, not necessarily the individual applications. Good. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.